Hi, I'm Alicia.
And I'm Robin, and you're listening to Bowel Moments,
the podcast sharing real talk about the realities of IBD. Served on the rocks. This week we talked to Dr. Erica Barnell. Dr. Barnell is the co-founder and chief medical and science officer for Geneoscopy. Geneoscopy is a life sciences startup company that leverages biomarkers to non-invasively diagnose, monitor, and treat gastrointestinal disease. This initially started out as a stool test to search for colon cancer in people in underserved communities and has now expanded to look at things like inflammatory bowel disease. We talked to her about the genesis of her original test and what that showed her. We talked to her about starting a company with her brother while also getting an MD, PhD, having a child, getting married, buying a house, and so much more. We talked to her about the FDA approval process, and we talked to her about RNA technology and what that's all about. Finally, we talk about her participating in the IBD Innovate conference, which allowed for her to expose her product to the inflammatory bowel disease space and seek out some venture capital. Cheers.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Bowel Moments. This is Robin.
Hey, guys. This is Alicia, and we are absolutely delighted to be joined by Dr. Erica Barnell. Dr. Barnell, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Please feel free to call me Erica.
Well, we shall at this point, now that you've given us permission. Thank you. Although I did make a comment to you that you worked very hard to become a doctor, so I'm a little reticent to do that. But Erica, welcome to the show again. Our very first unprofessional question for you is, what are you drinking?
Well, that's a great question. I've recently gotten into this very fun sparkling water called Spindrift, and my absolute favorite flavor is the orange tangerine. I go through about 4 or 5 of those a day.
I have not tried the orange tangerine yet, but it sounds lovely. We are also a fan of the fact that Spindrift, if you go to their website, gives you cocktail recipes for theirs and mocktail recipes as well. So if you're ever in the mood, you go to their website and you look up, it actually, you can sort by like the flavor of sparkling water you have, and then it'll give you kind of cocktails and mocktails. So not sponsored by Spindrift, but I'm just going to point it out to you that we're happy to be. That Topo Chico. Just
right.
That is definitely going to be the next bit of research that I conduct for sure.
Robin, what about you?
I am traveling for work right now while we are recording this, and it's going to be a late night, so I'm drinking coffee. And I also have water next to me. You know, I can't just have one beverage. I have still water and coffee.
I'm surprised it wasn't still sparkling and coffee, which is the usual for you.
I'm at a hotel, so I haven't actually gone to get the sparkling, but there would be sparkling as well. You know me, I have to have 3 beverages.
Yes. Well, today I actually have 2 beverages, neither of which are water. I have iced tea because it's just the day for it. And then I also have a lovely Italian white, and I would tell you what it is, but I don't know. So it's just an Italian white wine. So cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Okay. Erica, you are a slightly different guest for us, but so I'm going to ask you to tell a little bit of a prolonged story, but your story and then how that then connected you to inflammatory bowel disease.
Absolutely. So my medical journey kind of began nearly a decade ago. I had been doing undergraduate research at Washington University here in St. Louis, where I'm from, in a large microbiome lab. And I had been learning about environmental enteropathy. It actually looks like Crohn's disease, but it's caused by your environment, by bad water, parasites, things like that. And it afflicts mainly children in Africa and sub-Saharan Asia and India and things in that realm. And what we were trying to do in that laboratory is identify which children had that disease, provide treatment for those individuals, and then alleviate growth faltering. So that disease can cause kids to be stunted and falter in terms of their growth. And so when you're thinking about kids in Africa, we, really can't do scopes. There's not great access to healthcare there. And so we just had the moms send us diapers, and we were looking at the stool samples and pulling out specifically the RNA biomarkers in stool samples that were coming from the tissue in the GI tract. And we're really successful at quantifying the RNA biomarkers, diagnosing disease, and then subsequently providing antibiotics and making the water better and doing all these wonderful things to help these children live longer, healthier lives. So that was really my introduction to gastrointestinal health, to inflammatory disease, and kind of spurred my love for kind of medicine and translational medicine specifically.
Fantastic. And then after you're done with your undergraduate, you go to medical school, you continue on this path. now you've created a company, and we're going to come to that, but I want to talk about kind of how did inflammatory bowel disease start getting introduced in there? So when did IBD come into this picture?
Absolutely. So I had been doing this research as an undergraduate, at WashU. And in about 2014, I matriculated to the MD PhD program where I started my didactic training. I started becoming integrated into the clinics, started learning about the disease that we're seeing more commonly here in the United States. And that was really my first introduction to Crohn's disease, to ulcerative colitis, and colorectal cancer, which are the three indications that we focus on at Geneoscopy. And what I was seeing is so many unmet needs for those patients in terms of diagnosing, monitoring, and treating disease effectively and leveraging precision medicine approaches to inform clinical care. What I was seeing is a lot of physicians were having to perform trial and error. A lot of patients were being diagnosed with late stage cancer. A lot of patients were having a delay in diagnosis of their IBD or unable to achieve remission because they had to go through a series of various trials of ineffective treatments before they were put on the right method. And so kind of at that point, I thought to myself, we're developing this really cool technology in the lab. We're really successful at looking at RNA biomarkers in stool samples. Maybe we can apply this technology to some of the gastrointestinal diseases I was seeing in the clinic. And so at that time, I founded the company, pulled the technology out of the university, and we were looking at ways that we could apply that technology to, again, those diseases I was seeing in the clinic.
That is so cool. I think that there's so many people that are that we know that would much prefer to do something instead of a colonoscopy or an endoscopy. So it's awesome to think that this could be something that is applicable to a larger community, sort of beyond just kind of some of the standard things that we have that are maybe not as sensitive as they need to be. So Geneoscopy is the name of your company. I want to call it Geneoscopy, but that's not correct. It's Geneoscopy is the name of your company. So tell us, when you initially formed it, where were you at with this technology? Did you already have a product? Like, it sounds like you were using it when you were an undergrad and you were using it in Africa. How did you sort of take that existing technology and tweak it to be able to find the right biomarker to look for something? Because it sounds like you started in colon cancer, correct?
Absolutely. So I think, when you think about entrepreneurship, I always talk about building your entrepreneurial tool set, right? So, sometimes you're working on the product, sometimes you're working on your regulatory pathway, sometimes you're working on fundraising, sometimes you're working on intellectual property. So when we founded the company, we started thinking about, with the resources we have, time and money, what can we do to add the most value to the company? So I mentioned we kind of had this preliminary data to look at this indication that afflicts a really small number of people that we don't really see in clinic here. So moving that to an actual product we can provide to patients was a fun and long journey. I think what we did preliminarily was, validate that we could look at RNA biomarkers in stool samples for patients with IBD, for patients with colorectal cancer, for patients in the United States. We built out the collection kit to make it really easy for patients to provide a stool sample so they don't have to, deal with a lot of the ick factor associated with that. They don't have to bring it to the clinic. They don't have to touch it, right? So we spent a lot of time making it really easy and, safe for patients and something they would be willing to do. And then the most important thing I think we thought about was that regulatory pathway component. So trying to engage with the FDA to understand, whether it be for our oncology pipeline and colorectal cancer screening or for our IBD products, what clinical validation data are we going to need to demonstrate for this test or these tests to be approved?
I just want to jump in real fast and say, as someone who has had 7 colonoscopies in the past 2 years, and I have one scheduled in about 5 weeks, I would love to not have to have a colonoscopy again anytime soon, or at least in such short intervals. Also with the stool samples, yes. Agreed. Now, you kind of glanced over that whole, you just mentioned making it safe and being able to have patients use it in the US, but that's like a process to get approval to be able to have a product that's available for people to use. And you're just like one sentence. And I feel like that constituted a lot more than that one sentence indicated.
Yeah, it was a a long process. It's funny you mentioned that. I looked back in my archives, in my emails, and the first email that I sent to the FDA was back in 2016. And I just kind of cold called the head of the CDRH, who's one of the busiest, most important persons at the agency. And I said something along the lines of, "Hi, I'm a medical student. I'm interested in building a test for colorectal cancer screening." I gave her my phone number in case she wanted to call me, just really naive, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed medical student, excited to kind of get this process going. But, that was our first engagement with the FDA. She obviously directed me to a more formal process called a pre-submission that we held with them back in 2016. We held 3 or 4 more of those over the course of 5 years. And then we launched our pivotal study in 2021. Obviously, that was conducted during COVID. So some delays there, but we had a really innovative process that leveraged a decentralized model that was viewed as favorably by the FDA because we were able to kind of increase diversity and inclusion on that front. So, another 2 years for that pivotal study. And as you guys know, we received that approval decision for our colorectal cancer screening test more recently, about 2 or 3 weeks ago. So I think, end to end, like you're describing, it's a very long process. And I guess in retrospect, maybe I was, a little masochistic on that front. A lot of people told me, don't do this. This is too hard. A PMA is a really tough journey, but, I think there's always a way. And if there's a will, there's a way. And we definitely had the will, and we felt like our technology deserved to be in the hands of patients and providers. So I think now that I've done that process once in our oncology vertical, hopefully with our next product, specifically in the IBD space, it'll be a little bit easier.
I'm going to back you up just a second, because would you mind talking to the audience about what exactly is a biomarker?
Absolutely. So at Geneoscopy, we're a diagnostics healthcare company. And specifically, we look at RNA biomarkers in stool samples. So biomarkers can really be any analyte that comes from a sample, whether it's DNA or RNA or protein. It can be derived from the microbiome. It can be derived from your host cells. The sample type can be saliva. It can be urine. It can be stool. It can be blood. And really, our body just produces a lot of these analytes, a lot of these biomarkers that signal change in your health status. And so what we're trying to do as a diagnostics company is provide very accurate measurements of these changes using these biomarkers so that clinicians are more informed about what changes are happening to the patient so they can make effective modifications to the treatment plan.
Perfect. Thank you. Just to make sure, because I think I definitely think there's some confusion. Biomarkers just sort of sounds all like sciencey, but it's really, like you said, it's like these are the tests that they're doing, the things that they're looking at that just give you data to be able to tell what's going on. So I think that's cool.
It sounds so technical, but you poop in a cup, you send it to us. We look at it. We tell you if we think there's cancer. We tell you if we think there's IBD. We tell you how bad your IBD is. We tell you things like if it's T cell mediated or mucosal barrier mediated. We can hopefully provide, again, clinicians with more information to better treat your disease.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Advocacy groups are making a difference, not just for individual patients and families. They are also shaping the healthcare landscape for all of us. But who are these people fighting for patients' rights? What strategies lead to success? And what pitfalls should be avoided? Welcome to Patient Advocacy Voices. I'm your host, Eric Racine. Join me on a journey to uncover the hidden stories of these remarkable champions for patients. If you're passionate about advocating for patients and want to accelerate your own efforts for the patients you serve, subscribe now to Patient Advocacy Voices.
I'm going to ask you a question, and you can choose not to answer this one.
I probably will.
The wheels of technology turn slowly because of all of these things put in place to make sure that we're doing the right thing and that everything is tested and things like that. Sometimes the wheels of change within people's mind also turn very slowly. So I am curious about what you've had to face or how you've been able to get buy-in from the medical community to utilize your test. Because I know that there is a lot of, I know there's many people that would be like, if I can't see it, if I can't touch it, if I can't scope it, I'm not interested. So I'm wondering what sort of response that you've gotten from the medical community and if there's been things that you've needed to do to kind of get folks on board with using this versus perhaps going to a more traditional like scope method.
Absolutely. I mean, healthcare is a little weird because the person taking the test, the person prescribing the test, and the person paying for the test are all completely different entities, right? And they're motivated by completely different things. And so as a healthcare company, we have to consider all of those different motives and try to generate a product that has user needs that fit all of those various stakeholders in the process. So what we tried to do is be really rational about how we design our products to make sure that it fits into healthcare in a meaningful way. I feel so grateful for my education because I've been in clinics, I've been in the hospital, I've seen these patients, I've seen how billing works. I see the barriers that physicians have. I see the limited amount of time and resources that they have. So our goal has been to mitigate a lot of the barriers for payers, for patients, and for providers with our tests. I think one of the most robust arguments we have is that colonoscopy is a limited resource. It just is. If you look at the total number of GIs or general surgeons that we have in the country that are doing scopes, I think the total number of scopes that we can do as a country every year is about 10 million. And that's with every physician in the country working all the time, which they probably do. And yet we have 120 million Americans that are eligible for colorectal cancer screening. We have, 2 million Americans that are living with Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis that need multiple scopes, as Robin said, multiple times a year even. So what we're trying to do and what the GI community kind of agrees with is filter individuals into that very precious resource, the colonoscopy, that actually need it to have lesions removed or to have their disease evaluated for biopsies or for some kind of intervention. And I think that's really resonated with GIs and PCPs and surgeons on that front.
Do you find that there is a patient education component that needs to be addressed for their buy-in? Do you see that? Are you a part of that?
We are. I think, what I feel very fortunate is that nowadays patients have a lot of autonomy on their healthcare. They have a lot of access to resources on the internet. They have access to their charts on EHRs. And so what I've really found is that patients are relatively informed, or a lot of patients are relatively informed. And for patients that aren't, we can try to fill that gap with resources that we have. But most people go to their primary care physician at 45 and, they say, you need to get colorectal cancer screening. Most patients that have gastrointestinal distress from, some kind of GI disease, whether it's inflammatory or infectious, they know about it really, really quickly. And they know that they need to go see their primary or their GI doctor. And so I think in this day and age, we have a lot of information out there and we provide a lot of resources for patients, but patients really know a lot about their health and a lot about their body. And it's kind of great that they can kind of come to us and tell us what they need and we can build it.
The question I was going to ask Robin when I came off mute is that in just thinking about your scope is, Robin has had a J pouch. So she's had her colon removed. She hasn't had a colon in a long time, but we have plenty of folks. Oddly enough, I've joked we've become the J pouch podcast, but I'm curious if that changes anything about what you see, like scientifically, does that change anything about the microbiome or like what might show up in the types of, in what you're doing?
Yeah, so we're working actively right now on a variety of different patient populations, whether they have an ileostomy or a J pouch or recently had a reversal or, whatever it might be, and trying to understand how that's impacted with our tests. But to date, we've really only tested patients that have fortunately avoided too much of their bowel resection so that they kind of, maintain that junction. But it's something we're very actively interested in understanding.
Yeah, it's just something I'm curious about because one of the things we've noted for a lot of folks that live with J pouches is, things tend to go back to normal as if, or more similar to when it was like, having a, your full GI set. And so it is interesting to see how kind of your small intestine can adapt and grow and change to fit it. But I would imagine it still is not quite the same. So I'm curious about that. Okay, talking a little bit more about RNA technology. Will you give us this, I don't know if you can do a 6th grade version of this, but give us the like high school version of what we need to know about exactly what that means. With RNA, like with RNA vaccines, they get a little scared, they get a little nervous.
Yes. And I think, again, this is another benefit of patients know a lot about their health and, come to me with questions like that. How I explain it, I mentioned at Geneoscopy, we look at RNA biomarkers and we look at stool samples. The reason that we look at stool samples is that it's the direct source of the tissue that's coming from the disease. So if you have Crohn's disease, it can be from your small bowel or your large bowel or your rectum. If you have ulcerative colitis, it's a little bit more distal. So usually it's in your large bowel, inclusive of the valves there. And what we like to do is pull out all the cells that are being sloughed from the lining of the colon and the small bowels, lyse those open, and look at those markers that are there. So you could imagine that if you have a large area of inflamed tissue from Crohn's disease or from ulcerative colitis, those cells are going to be sloughed into the stool. Those stool is going to go into that bucket, and that bucket is getting shipped to our laboratory. So once it's in our lab, we actually have a sample of the tissue that is being impacted by the disease. And so at that point, we just pick out those cells, lyse them open, and we look at the RNA biomarkers that are there. So RNA is actually a really interesting molecule. It is basically a copy of the DNA, which houses all the information that your cell would need to grow and divide and create changes and do the actions that it needs to do to live. And the RNA provides the instructions to kind of do that process. So RNA is a very dynamic molecule. It can change very quickly. If your cell, needs to shift and make more proteins in one direction, if it needs to shift and make more proteins in another direction, it automatically does that and shifts very quickly. And so that's why we chose RNA biomarkers for our analyte of choice. We feel that specifically for IBD, the RNA transcriptome is truly reflective of the dynamic nature of that disease and gives you really good insight into what's going on in the body and what type of inflammation is happening and what's causing problems.
Does it depend on where the disease is? Are you finding a difference in results based on if it is in the colon or small intestines, whether it's ileum or jejunum or even stomach? Is there a difference in the results?
It definitely does. And I think location in the total GI tract, as well as location, deep to the lumen, right? If the inflammation's happening at the mucosal barrier, or is there fat creeping, in the inner layers, those are all different mediators of the disease. And what we're seeing is there's a variety of different pathways that are dysregulated in Crohn's and ulcerative colitis that cause those various different types of manifestations of the disease. I think one of the really interesting things that we're really focused on is fibrotic disease. That can be unbelievably debilitating. It can kind of come out of nowhere. It typically requires surgery. It's typically irreversible. And so being able to predict not only where in the GI tract, but how extensive that fibrosis is something that's very important to me. And I think going to be very important for patients. So yeah, that's also a very active part of research that we're conducting at Geneoscopy.
Yeah, that would be incredibly life-changing because I'm thinking, there are some people that their disease is progressing in such a dynamic and terribly dynamic way that it would be nice to be able to predict some of this. So that's what you mentioned is that the 3 kind of areas you're looking at for specifically inflammatory bowel disease, now that you've sort of targeted that, is really looking at diagnosing, monitoring it, but also then trying to figure out trying to predict how people might respond to treatment, thus trying to figure out what would be the better treatment for folks. So tell me where you're at with those, number one, because I think, again, I joked with you that I think everybody'd like to know that this is ready tomorrow. And talk a little bit about, so where are you at with each of them? How far along the path? And then are there specific aspects of what you're looking at that helps you figure this out? I've asked you three very large questions there, so I'm going to put myself on mute and you're going to talk for a long time probably.
Yeah, so we've been conducting feasibility research for about a year now on IBD. I think we've defined a couple of areas of unmet need, like you're discussing. We really don't have a lot of non-invasive ways to diagnose disease. I think most physicians rely on calprotectin and CRP, which especially for Crohn's disease can be non-specific. And I think PCPs beyond that have a lot of trouble trying to build a differential with the tools that they currently have. So we've done a lot of active research on diagnosis, and we feel that one is going to be the easiest path to get another tool into physicians' hands in terms of both the product development and the regulatory pathway. The next two are a little bit tougher, I think, because of how dynamic this disease is. So looking at monitoring disease activity, our approach to that is looking at the various different mechanisms of inflammation that are mediated in Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, and trying to understand if a pathway is dysregulated, how bad it's dysregulated, and then sum all that information into a score that patients can look at and say, okay, I'm in remission, but maybe it's creeping up. Maybe it's getting a little bit worse, and they can monitor that over time. And then once we kind of pass that threshold into I'm having an active flare, is it a mild flare? Is it a moderate flare? Is it a, significant severe flare? And kind of how quickly is it moving? I think that's going to be really important for patients to be able to, again, autonomously evaluate their disease without going in for a scope every 6 months. That one's a little bit further off, but we just finished a manuscript that will be submitted for peer review very shortly. So hopefully that data will be available. It was also presented at Digestive Disease Week a couple of weeks ago. The last one I think is really the holy grail. Predicting therapeutic response has been something that this field needs for such a long time. I've heard so many stories of patients that went through the gauntlet with insurance specifically to try to get their medications paid for, to try to justify those medications, their biologics, getting denied over and over again for not a lot of good reason, being pushed to a generic for not a lot of good reason. And so I want to give patients and providers a molecular objective measure that this disease is being caused by this pathway. This biologic would be efficacious for that individual. And maybe it'll allow physicians to bypass going through ASA and a steroid treatment and a methylpred and something that we know doesn't work 4 times before they can get on their Remicade. So I think that's the holy grail. It's definitely going to take a little bit longer, but what I feel very confident is that we do have the technology. Today, we're in a place that we were 20 years ago in oncology, where we were just starting to apply precision medicine approaches to stratifying patients with tumors and convincing insurance companies that even though this is a liver cancer, they have a VEGF mutation, so we should be giving them a VEGF inhibitor. And I think we can apply those same principles to IBD. And I definitely think that Geneoscopy has a really great technology to be able to do that.
Yeah, that is so, like you said, holy grail. I think everybody is cheering for you behind their earbuds. One thing that we've noted, one thing that's happened for probably a few patients now that have been on our show is that they've been diagnosed with ulcerative colitis, later diagnosed with Crohn's disease, Robin being one of them. So I'm curious, as you're looking at this sort of diagnostic tool, is that something you're looking at? Is there a way to maybe better determine whether somebody has Crohn's disease versus ulcerative colitis?
Yeah, I think right now it's been a geographical diagnosis, right? And phenotypic diagnosis. And so again, I think having an objective biomarker that says this is not IBS, it's IBD. Of the IBD, we think it looks more like Crohn's, even though it's rectal. I think we're definitely moving in that direction. I'm definitely going to start with the lower hanging fruit, which is this is not IBS, this is IBD. But I think as we continue to gather data, as we continue to get samples from patients, I expect those populations to separate based on the transcriptome, and hopefully we'll not be putting patients into a cohort that necessarily don't belong there for no other reason than we just don't have the tools to do that. I'm sorry to hear about that. That sounds kind of miserable.
I'm shrugging it off like, it's been 24 years. It's fine.
It's still 24 years, Robin. So there's that side of it. You mentioned payers, and I am so curious where those come into play here. And I'm glad that you're thinking about payers as a piece of this puzzle as you're sort of developing things, because I think sometimes when people are doing research and they're researchers, they don't necessarily think about the fact that there's still sort of that element that's going to gatekeep. And so I'm really glad that you've looked at that. At what point did you introduce that? And I'm curious what that's been like to also bring payers into the equation to talk to them about how they're going to incorporate this into the benefits that people get.
I do think that a lot of entrepreneurs, especially in diagnostics, don't do it early enough. I think that's been part of our conversation since the beginning. We can't be a successful company if we don't get paid for our services. Physicians can't prescribe our test if they feel like their patient's going to get a big out-of-pocket bill, right? And I think so having that as part of the conversation as early as possible is so important. It impacts a lot of components of our product development. It impacts a regulatory pathway. It impacts the indication for use that we need, which will subsequently impact the clinical validation studies that we need to conduct. And I think generating the data that will convince insurance companies not only is this safe and effective for our patients, but maybe it's going to help and maybe it's going to save us money in the long run. If a patient is put on a really ineffective treatment for 10 months and then they end up in the hospital with fistulating disease and a stricture and they need half of their colon resected and they're in the hospital and then there's a complication and they're in the hospital for longer, that's expensive to a payer. So if we can demonstrate not only that our diagnostic is safe and efficacious, but it's preventing morbidities associated with the disease, that's something that's going to convince the insurance companies that they need to be covering our test and allowing physicians to use it regularly. And I think that's important because generating that data is equally as important as showing the data that tells you how the diagnostic works. So I think companies should be thinking about both preventing morbidity and mortality, which helps you with your payers, and demonstrating how good your device is.
So you mentioned collecting samples and sort of, getting samples from the community. How do you go about that? Is this something you're like actively recruiting for now? How does that work?
So we just closed up our pivotal study for our colorectal cancer screening tests. But in that study, I kind of mentioned that we did a decentralized recruitment model. So we didn't have any sites. Typically, traditional models that recruit patients for studies go to endoscopy centers, for example, and they ask nurses at the centers to recruit patients onto the study. We took a completely different approach and we actually just used social media to find patients where they are. So we had people click on our ads and then we would have a nurse call them at their home. We'd send a DocuSign to, complete informed consent, talk to them over the phone. And then we just drop ship a collection kit to patients' residence. They provided a stool sample. There was a return label right on the box, put it on their doorstep, click a button on their phone, and FedEx comes and picks it right up. So I think using that decentralized clinical trial approach had a lot of big benefits for identifying patients. We were able to get a lot of patients that don't have a lot of access to healthcare. We have a lot of patients that maybe their primary care physician is 45 minutes away at the local big city that they're in. We were able to get a lot of patients that have health disparities, a lot of patients that have low health literacy that were just interested in learning more. And what we found was for a lot of people, we were their first engagement with the healthcare community. And we were hopefully providing them with, positive experiences so that they continued to engage with healthcare in a positive way. So that study we wrapped up last year. For the IBD products, we are starting to launch studies for recruiting patients soon. So hopefully that'll be sometime next year that we're going to be engaging again with the community to identify individuals that are eligible for the studies that we're evaluating.
That is very cool. I mean, I like the fact that you're trying specifically to reach out to people that are in this sort of, like you said, health disparities and different groups of folks. And you might not have been part of this, but I'm curious how you went about making sure that that was a priority and how you really did get it into the kind of the right phones and tablets.
I came from WashU and they have a huge public health school. And I think that definitely influenced me when I founded the company. I've seen healthcare disparities. I've seen inequities. I've seen a lot of clinical trials where it's not representative of the intended use population. And so you can't necessarily trust that data to be reflected on your patient population, which looks a little bit different. So it was really important to me and to the entire Geneoscopy team that we were looking at the intended use population for our clinical trial. And then I think another big benefit, you mentioned that we're trying to convince GIs that we're not taking away their business and we're not, trying to prevent patients from getting colonoscopies who need it. So by using that decentralized model, I mentioned that we engaged with people who hadn't yet engaged with the healthcare community to date. We identified 64% of all enrolled patients had never before been screened with a colonoscopy or any other molecular test. So that's in direct contrast to site-based models when you're intervening at the endoscopy center, right? And 100% of patients have a colonoscopy already scheduled. So I think by reaching people where they are, by trying to use, modalities that people are really familiar with that kind of fit into their lifestyle, that's kind of who we are at Geneoscopy. And that's the patient population that we want to help with our test.
Note to GIs, there are plenty of us to go around. You don't have to worry about losing any business. There are so many of us available to do multiple tests across the board. Your money is safe. I promise you, your money is safe. Look at me, 7 scopes and a pill cam and how many fecal tests? I mean, believe me, there's enough of us to go around.
And yeah. I agree with you there. It's such a valuable resource. And I do feel that we need to make sure that we're preventing patients from undergoing unnecessary colonoscopy, and that patients that need to have some kind of intervention, whether it's a biopsy or, a polypectomy or anything, those are the patients that we need to give colonoscopy.
Well, or even just for somebody like Robin to have less colonoscopy. Maybe she has 1 colonoscopy a year instead of 7, is there a way for us to have a test that she can take that doesn't require her to go and get a full-on colonoscopy every single time? That would be super valuable for our community.
We're working on it.
Good. So much better than it was 24 years ago already.
And that's what kind of gives me a lot of hope, right? I think for the 17-year-olds that are getting diagnosed now, I think we're seeing a lot better pathways for them than the patients that I'm seeing that, my grandmother has ulcerative colitis, and she at this point, she's been on so much prednisone that her skin just sloughs off, and I think that if she had been on a biologic in her 40s and put into remission, her life might be a lot different right now. So I feel hopeful that the technology is catching up with the clinics and we're starting to see change in pathways for newly diagnosed patients.
Yes. Yeah. There has been a huge monumental shift in, I think, how we're treating inflammatory bowel disease. But this idea of precision medicine and being able to get people to the right medication as fast as possible, I think is just so enticing. And, like that piece that we're just reaching for. So, yeah.
And even when we had Dr. Rubin and Dr. Binion on the show, they were talking about the subcategories, like really following work that they've done in arthritis, in rheumatic diagnosis, where there's more specific disease identification, where it's not just ulcerative colitis or Crohn's. And I think that aligns perfectly with what you're talking about, being able to identify the pathway and then prescribe the medicine that specifically addresses that pathway. It's very, very exciting. I have said often, if you're going to be diagnosed, now's the time. Not 20 years ago. Now's the time. So
it's so true. And I mean, you think 20 years ago, I think Humira was around, in 2002 was his approval date for rheumatoid arthritis. Yeah. But, 20 years ago, we didn't even have, one of our first line treatments that we have today. So we've definitely come a long way. And I think that it's hope is on the horizon. I like to think about that, hopefully.
And I think our attitudes toward these medications should have shifted so drastically as well. Like I mentioned multiple times, my dad had multiple sclerosis, not inflammatory bowel disease, but, the biologics that were in place when he was first diagnosed, there was one. And the comment he got when he was diagnosed is, well, you don't need that because you're not that bad. It's like, well, how do you know? Number one. But also, isn't that the point? And that's not the way they looked at it. It was like they looked at it as in okay, if you're going to have a very severe course, then that's when we're going to prescribe these biologics. And now, like you said, this is the front line. The front line is a biologic, and getting people to understand that and especially getting them to understand. I think these medications, especially, if it's an infusion, has that sort of negative connotation of it being like chemotherapy. And so people are a little bit scared. They feel like it's like an injection and infusion that's like feels very big. So it feels like a huge escalation. So that's a big difference.
And I did hear now they're doing the sub-Q versions too. And I think a big proponent that we're focused on as a diagnostics company, I know the pharmaceutical companies are, from a therapeutic perspective, is the patient experience and trying to integrate, wearables, or trying to integrate a collection device that fits in with their lifestyle, or integrate a sub-Q injection instead of these infusions. And I think those initiatives are so beneficial. Just patients should be able to live their lives in the way that anybody else does. And so trying to make sure that the patient piece is integrated is really important.
Well, and making sure patients are there from the beginning, making sure that patient input is being put into every piece of what you're developing, whether it be a medication or a diagnostic. It's like saying, is this something that you will use? Is this something that fits into your lifestyle? Because if it's too onerous, people won't use it. They're not going to choose it, and so if you start from the beginning with asking people what they want, what they need, they're going to tell you, and you're going to have a product that people actually use. Shocking.
I love that idea of, during our Geneoscopy brainstorming sessions at our table of scientists, we have the proverbial patient, the proverbial insurance carrier, and the proverbial, provider. And I think just thinking about that and having that part of your thought process is so important.
Absolutely. I'm going to back you up in a slightly different direction, but starting a company is a really big deal. And you went from actually having like a real job that pays well, and deciding then to throw all of that out the window and start your company. So talk through deciding to create your own company and the thought process that went into that, like everything that went into it, because that's a risk.
Oh gosh. Yeah, I tell my team I've never had a real job. So I mentioned that I kind of matriculated to the MD PhD program in 2014. And at that time I was that bright-eyed, bushy-tailed medical student who could tackle the world. So why not start a company? I'm not busy. And then at that time we had this idea, and we were going to apply it to oncology for colorectal cancer screening. So I just did a couple of pitch competitions just to kind of test the waters and see if people were interested. And we got a lot of interest. And so it just kind of kept snowballing and snowballing. And at one point I was asked for a business plan competition to put together some pro formas and some financial statements and a balance sheet. And I Googled it really quickly and realized that it was way over my head. So I called my brother, who at the time was an MBA at Wharton, and he leveraged some of the coursework he was doing to kind of help me along the way. We realized very quickly that we worked unbelievably well together. And so we kind of joined forces at that time, him on the business side, me on the research science side, and we just pushed the company forward. So I kind of kept that going through my 2 didactic years of medical school, through my PhD, which was at a dry lab. We were looking at building sequencing pipelines. But then I did take a year off, or a year and a half, to set up our pivotal study, make sure that was running smoothly, build out our lab, build out our team. I actually had a baby in the middle of that, got married, moved into a house, and then I went back and finished my clerkships, which was about 20 months of medical training. But then when I graduated from the MD PhD program in 2023, last spring, and I was able to kind of do the company full time. So the pivotal trial just kind of wrapped up. We had just submitted it to the FDA. And so I really feel like now I can do the things that I've always wanted to do. I can kind of apply my education. I can apply everything I've learned over the last 10 years to being a full-time chief medical officer, and really serve the company in terms of directing the products to make sure that the patient, the provider, the payers are at that table, and making sure that what we're building is valuable to patients. But other than kind of, these 9 months of being full-time at the company, I really have just been a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed medical student for sure.
Well, that's awesome. And it's great to have a brother that is helpful in his skill set. So that's great. And you guys continue to work together. So is there Is there any advice you'd give to people who are attempting to work with their siblings?
I often tell people, when I tell people that I work with my brother with a company that we started together, I get a very dichotomous reaction. It's either, oh, that would be so fun, or I don't think I could survive that. I personally believe it to have been instrumental in the success of the company. I obviously was going through so much with medical school, with pregnancy, with, everything else going on, that having somebody that I intrinsically trust, somebody that has known me my whole life, somebody that I can count on and rely on to kind of share that burden with me and the highs and lows of entrepreneurship. I don't think I would have made it without him. And so I feel really grateful that I had him on this journey. I think anybody would be lucky to kind of do what I did and be able to start a company with a sibling or a parent or whatever it might be, or even just a best friend. I think it's a lot of work, and really having somebody that you love and trust be there with you and experiencing those milestones together. The day that we got FDA approval, he was my first call, and we were just so happy. So being able to share those moments is so memorable.
I definitely feel like it also helps with any of your pitch decks as well, to be able to be like, look, our family business is set up. So that might help you a little bit. But I also think there's something to be said about just the fact of like having a partner that you every once in a while can say like, I don't like you right now, but I love you and we're going to get through this, is super helpful, probably, I would imagine. So I think there's definitely something to be said about sort of that bond that kind of goes beyond the work side of things.
It's funny you mentioned that because we share the same last name. I didn't change my name. So the first questions investors ask are you two married? And we say, no, we're siblings. And they say, great, we weren't going to invest if you guys were married.
Fair.
We do
That
get
is fair.
That is fair.
We get that sometimes, for sure.
Mhm.
That's funny. Well, and just based on the pictures on your company website, you don't necessarily look terribly much alike. So I would imagine, yes, you definitely do get that question.
Thank you. I'm kidding.
All right. So not too long ago, you participated in something called the IBD Innovate Conference. This is a conference put on by the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation here in the United States. Tell us a little bit about what is that and kind of what was your participation in it exactly?
Absolutely. It's an incredible program. The Crohn's and Colitis Foundation really proactively seeks out the needs of the community and then delivers on it. I think some of the things we were talking about in terms of getting the payers involved, getting, the insurance companies, getting the hospitals involved, getting everybody, all stakeholders involved, they kind of recognize that. The result was IBD Innovate. So when I attended, I really didn't know who was going to be there, but it was everybody. It was patients, it was providers, it was, the greats in the field that discovered the original therapies for disease. It was the venture capitalist companies that are supporting IBD research, just any person that you needed to talk to understand how your company could fit into clinics and be integrated into clinics was present. So it's just an incredible opportunity that we had to kind of speak to the key opinion leaders across the entire spectrum of who's involved in IBD research and clinics and make sure that what we're doing is appropriate. Our contribution or our participation was that we presented the feasibility work that we've been doing for our IBD diagnostics with regards to diagnosing, monitoring, predicting therapeutic response for disease. And what, again, was really great is from that presentation, a number of pharmaceutical companies kind of came up to us after and said, wow, this is unbelievable technology. We didn't know about this. How can we get involved? So I think, that conference for me really bridged that gap that we have between those silos within the IBD community. And I really applaud the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation for kind of filling that need there.
That is really, really cool. I do think that's such a cool idea just to get, like you said, everybody to come to the table, especially venture capital. I think that is, it's nice to be able to shortcut that, especially if you're a smaller company, you don't necessarily understand the landscape. You're a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed med student that doesn't understand what venture capital can do or how it needs to be integrated in. And so I think that's a really cool idea. So now that you've done the IBD Innovate Conference, what are the next steps?
I would say, what we want to do, especially for predicting therapeutic response, is integrate our diagnostic into the phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials for the novel therapeutics that are coming out. I think we've had a couple of different mechanisms of action that we know work. But one of the things I'm really excited about is there are incredibly novel mechanism of actions, completely different pathways that are being evaluated for efficacy for novel therapeutics. And so the total number of therapies that are going to be coming on market in the next couple of years is going to be expansive. So hopefully if we allow ourselves to get integrated into those clinical trials as they become approved, in the same way we do it in oncology, we can build that companion diagnostic at the same time that they're being approved.
That would be absolutely amazing. That would be amazing information to have.
I'm curious. So right now, people have to send samples into to your lab, and then that gets tested and everything, and then you get sort of the response back. Are you looking at how to potentially make this into more of like a home pregnancy test, where it's just, you collect your stool sample, and then there's like a dipstick, or there's something that you're able to do on your own to be able to test yourself?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, that technology isn't necessarily there yet. I think IBD is so complicated in terms of the pathways that are dysregulated. It's so complicated in terms of making sure that everything's standardized in input. Again, we've tried to make it really easy for patients. It's kind of like poop and go, and especially patients with IBD who have gone through the gauntlet of healthcare. Pooping in a cup and then texting FedEx is pretty easy at this point, especially if you don't have to touch it, you don't have to bring it to the clinic, you don't have to do anything, right? So I think our hope is that is the process for the foreseeable future. But I've seen crazier things happen. So there's definitely a possibility that we could integrate into a toilet or, do a wearable or something else that can accurately evaluate disease in a non-invasive way.
I, first of all, love talking to researchers, Erica. Like, as an IBD patient, it's my favorite thing to do. They're all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, no matter how old they are and how recently or how long ago they were in school. It brings me joy every time I get to listen to a researcher talk. So thank you so much for coming on the show. Plus, brand new kind of guest. Like, this is a whole new avenue for our listeners. So I'm excited for them to hear everything that you have to say. But it's time, unfortunately, for me to ask you the last question. What do you want the IBD community to know? So you can do advice for providers and patients. What do you want them to take away from our conversation today?
I think what I want both patients and providers to know is we're kind of at a precipice for research, and we've been climbing that research mountain for a really long time. And I think the technology has caught up with the needs of patients and providers. So now we can start transforming that research into things that can actually be used by patients and providers. And I feel grateful that I'm here at that time where the technology has caught up with the patient's needs. And I think for a long time, we were using blunted knives to operate in the IBD space, but I feel really confident that with these new therapies, with the new diagnostics, with the new wearable devices, we can mitigate the time between symptoms and initial diagnosis. We can mitigate the time between diagnosis and first remission. We can keep people in remission for a really long time and prevent them from having those catastrophic events. So I think hang in there. There's hope on the horizon. We see you. We know that you're suffering, and we're here to help. And hopefully some of that suffering can be mitigated with a lot of these new things that are getting into the hands of physicians shortly.
Fantastic advice, and definitely hope giving, I think, for a lot of people. So thank you so very much. And thank you for sharing your brilliant mind with our community. I think there's so much that's good that's come out of that. So thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you everyone else for listening, and cheers with my empty glass.
Me too. Empty coffee. Cheers, everybody.
Hi, this is Dr. Erica Barnell. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, subscribe, and share it with your friends.